Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's Creative Climate Chat. So this is episode 4. I'm Ruby from the Julie's Bicycle team. So just a little bit about us. So JB is a charity working across the creative sector to catalyse the green creative economy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we've worked with more than 2,000 organisations, NGOs and governments worldwide. So our approach is to harness the creative sector's power to communicate the reality of the climate crisis, advocate for science-based solutions and take bold practical action. And since 2012, we've also been the Arts Council's delivery partner for their environmental programme. So we support the portfolio to report their carbon footprints, develop environmental policies and action plans. So Farah's going to tell you a little bit more about how this episode fits in very shortly. But just to say, do check out our free resources, events, tools and guides on the website. And remember that this is the start of a conversation. So please do stay in touch with us with any queries on how we can support you with your creative climate action. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of housekeeping very shortly, and then I will hand over to Farah to kick off this conversation. So just to let you all know that the conversation today is going to be recorded, so your mics and videos have been turned off. You can use the Q&A function, so that's just at the bottom of your screens if you've got any questions throughout, and we may call on you to ask your question if we've got time. And if you've got any technical difficulties, you'll see in the attendees box there's Julie's Bicycle, so that's our colleague Chiara. She's going to be on hand to help resolve those, so please use the chat function and flag those with her. If you have any issues, just select all panelists and we'll be able to help. And then we've got socials, so please do join the conversation. You'll see that our hashtag is Creative Climate Chat. Please use your preferred channels. We're at Julie's Bicycle, at Rajwinder S. Pal, and at Colonial Country 1 handles. You can see those on the slide as well. And then finally, we are live streaming today's session, so my colleague Chiara is going to be sharing that link in the chat with you now, so feel free to share that with others to help join in the conversation as well. And again, they can ask their questions by using the Creative Climate Chat hashtag. So just a very quick temperature check. We've been asking people just to add into the chat box how they're feeling at the moment, this sense of a green recovery for COVID. Some of the responses we've had so far, we've had pessimist, hopeful, worried, non-negotiable, doubtful, curious and urgent. So just to give you a flavour and kind of acknowledge a sense of how we're all feeling in the room before we kick off. So just before I pass over to Farah, I wanted to start with a poll question. So I am going to launch that for you now. You'll see that pop up on your screens. We'll just take a couple of moments. If you can help us by filling that in. The question there is, asks you, during COVID-19 lockdown, I have A, struggled to feel connected with nature because of a lack of access to green space, B, been able to spend more time outside in nature, or C, felt no more or less connected to nature than usual. So if you don't mind, just have a quick think about that. Don't spend too long, just pop your thoughts in. We will close that very shortly and we'll come back to it at the end. So we'll just leave that open for a few more moments. Okay, and I will hand over to Farah.
Great, thank you, Ruby, and welcome to everyone who's listening in. For those of you who've joined us for our previous Creative Climate Chats, so with Lucy Davies, Chaitanya Kumar and Paul Dickinson, we've talked about how the social sector is responding to net zero targets, intersectional climate policy making, a just green cultural recovery from COVID-19 and corporate. Today is a little different, and this episode will be part of the second season of Colour Green, which is part of our Arts Council environmental programme, where we spotlight artists and creative practitioners of colour whose work speaks to the interactions between climate justice, social justice and nature. So in the first season, which was Baroness Lola Young, we spoke to Hannah Joseph Budge, Zena Edwards, Green Days, and Judy Ling Wong. So I'm seeing that my audio isn't working very well. So let me just deal with that very quickly. Okay. 2 seconds. That is very strange. I'll carry on. Sorry. You can listen back to the podcast on our website and on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast services. So we're in a moment where the global structures that govern our lives are being exposed and challenged by the social, medical, and economic upheaval brought on by COVID-19, by the painful and necessary rallying cry that Black Lives Matter, and by the increasing visibility of the impacts of climate and environmental emergency, which we're seeing in extreme weather events, in biblical locust swarms across Africa and Asia, in devastating species loss, wildfires and deadly heat waves, amongst so much more. So these aren't separate phenomena. They exist in a complex ecology of violence, extraction of resources, people and nature from land, and a system which then places those resources, people and nature in competition with each other for profit. We know that this system doesn't work, and the science tells us that we have just a decade to implement the sweeping and drastic changes we need to limit the worst effects of climate change. We have an opportunity right now to radically transform our world in service of the well-being of planet and people, and in pursuit of a just green future for all. So through all of this, we have to develop a deeper understanding of the path that has led us to this point. Just as we know that some communities in the UK are significantly more likely to be severely impacted by COVID, we know that people in the global south and marginalized communities in the global north are more affected by climate impacts, even though historically they've contributed the least carbon emissions. This isn't an accident, it's the legacy of our colonial histories and how they continue to play out now through the structures of systemic racism and economic inequality. The recent toppling of statues commemorating slave traders, industrialists, and colonial figures is symbolic of a real reckoning which we must engage with in our conversations of what climate justice actually means. So economists estimate that an equivalent of $45 trillion was siphoned off from India during the era of British colonialism. When the slave trade was abolished, it wasn't the slaves who received reparations, but instead in the UK, 3,000 families who saw themselves as their owners, who received £20 million, which is equivalent to £16.5 billion now, and which the UK taxpayer only finished paying back in 2015. It matters because our industrialized world was built on colonial extraction. So many fossil fuel companies and banks are rooted in that injustice. A significant number of our ruling elite can trace their wealth and power to colonialism, and those who were exploited are now the people fleeing their homes because a once-in-a-lifetime superstorm is happening year on year. They're being poisoned by our toxic waste, and environmental activists in those communities are being murdered by governments and corporations at a higher rate than activists for any other single issue. But it also empowers us to acknowledge what these communities can teach us about fighting against these huge, powerful systems and being able to imagine radical new worlds because they've been doing it for centuries. Their stories contain so many solutions to our current crises, but are often unheard or erased from a conversation which is dominated by more powerful voices with more pervasive myths and stories about our society, our economy, and our planet. Which brings us to this afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Raj Pal, a curator, art historian, lecturer, and writer. Raj works on Colonial Countryside, which is a child-led writing and history project, working to uncover the National Trust House's Caribbean and East India Trading Company connections. So welcome, Raj, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. And social distance greeting. Yeah, it's a real pleasure. It's a real joy to be able to join. Please fire away.
Thank you, Raj. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and how you came into this space?
Okay. That's a very interesting question. It's got. I mean, unlike a lot of people, the road that I've taken to being where I am, which isn't very far, by the way, is quite a crooked one. I started sort of my post-university career. Well, pre-university, my career was as a foundry worker and a taxi driver and factory hand and all that sort of stuff. Post-university, my career was mostly as a lecturer in history and sociology for a number of years. And then I came into the museum's profession about 25 years ago. And that was as a curator for a sort of like a big blockbuster exhibition at Birmingham, co-curator, I should really say, for a real blockbuster exhibition at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery called Treasures from the Courts of Mughal India. They needed someone, they didn't have the expertise at that time to have someone who had knowledge of Indian history, Indian art, and I sort of fulfilled that criteria. So, and for me, it was sort of like love at first sight. Now, although I did go back to some lecturing later on, I really stayed within that sort of museums, but also sort of like broad cultural kind of field as both as a curator, as a practitioner, but also as a manager. And now I work as a freelance, and I work for really a number of organizations. I'm working quite extensively for the National Trust at the moment. I've also worked with the National Archive and a number of others. So it's a case of have lands, will kill, will travel.
Well, thank you for being here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about colonial countryside, and if you can explain that. And really it's about uncovering a lot of the hidden histories and challenging the myths that we've come to accept about England's green and pleasant land. So why do you think that this work is so important, and what does this deeper understanding add to our conception of nature and heritage in the UK?
Well, Colonial Countryside it's a project that's been running for a few years, just a few years, and it's I think it's 11 properties across the National Trust. It's a project that's managed and directed by one of my colleagues, my friend Dr. Corinne Fowler, and it's essentially, in a nutshell, it's a project that works with young children from primary, junior school background. And they are in the sort of age group of sort of like sort of 11 plus, as it were. And it's essentially getting younger people from not almost exclusively, but largely multicultural city schools who have a very low level of engagement often with culture, but particularly with the National Trust. They go to National Trust properties and look at those properties with their eyes, because often the display, the interpretation at properties, unless it's challenged, unless you have sort of renewal and reinterpretation, can be a bit fusty, and as I'm very fond of saying, can be a bit Laura Ashley. And it's amazing. I've seen some young people. I'm now worked a little bit with some young people, because I'm one of the advisors on the group of historians who advise on this program. And I have seen and I've met young people who've been absolutely not just transformed by the work that they've done in, for instance, relabeling, in re-seeing, in sort of kind of interpreting objects and houses that nobody else has been able to see for years and years, but who've then gone on to infect those houses, some of their curators, etc., with their energy. So I think in that sense, it's a fantastic thing, because these young people, they are the future. They are. I mean, I was saying to someone yesterday, you know, they are in a sense, they're the children of empire. I mean, someone like me, for instance, I see myself as first generation, the other who's here. But then I see you and I see my children as no longer as the other who's here. They are this. So I think to get younger people to take a fresh look at National Trust properties has been hugely beneficial, and it's just fantastic.
So how might heritage professionals, and how do you, working with the National Trust, balance that imperative to preserve things as they were versus building an understanding of present to the past? So something that's being raised by Black Lives Matter, but also by climate change. Do we invest millions into protecting monuments or properties as they were, or do we accept that we can't save everything in a changing climate because of erosion, changing weather patterns, and the shifts in how we as a society? What should we invest in? Could we invest in instead?
Gosh, that's about 3 or 4 questions rolled into one. So I'll try and remember them. Let me try and do justice to them one by one. First of all, why shouldn't we just preserve the past? I ask a rhetorical question. Are you still driving a car that your grandparents were driving? You're not. Are you still, do you not use internet? Do you not use Twitter? Do you not eat differently to the way your grandparents ate? If all of that is a sign of the times, as it were, that we live in times when things are available, social media is available, resources are available, points of view, for instance, that are available that were never available in the past. Would you neglect all of that? So sort of continue living in some sort of cocoon in the 1950s and 1940s, or even going back earlier? You wouldn't. And I think that same idea, you juxtapose that to looking at the past. I've been doing a little bit thinking about Churchill lately, and Churchill very fondly said, history will be kind to me because I will write it. He made sure to write it. Now, there's an old African adage that the history of the jungle is written by lions. Until we hear from the gazelles, we never really know the true picture. So I think it's a good thing to revisit the past because we find ways of seeing. One of the kind of emotional things for me, one of the books that really shaped me as a human being was actually In One Single Day on a Beach in Turkey nearly 25 years ago. And that book was John Burge's Ways of Seeing. And it's a really, in a sense, it's a really simple book. But the amazing thing is that it pushes you as a human being not to take for granted everything that you have taken for granted. You actually look at the world differently, and you are enriched by that. There's a general kind of pool of knowledge that's enriched. So I think we can't continue to live in a cocoon. The world is ever changing, and it's a fascinating thing that you keep track of that, and you change, and so on and so forth. And you avail of all the sort of new thinking, new resources, etc. Coming to the sort of kernel of your question, rather than I think I know that you're very eager to find out my views on statues and what have you. I think there is I think I'll put it really subtly. See, statues are not like monuments. They're not like literature. They're not even like paintings or artwork or music, etc. Because if you have, say, for instance, a painting, yeah. Let's say a building, for instance, yeah. Let's say Powys Castle in Lord Clive of India's family seat in Powys in Welshpool. You can't take the statue approach to it, but what you can do is you can reinterpret the collection at that museum as elsewhere, for instance, yeah, in the light of new understanding, in the light of new knowledge, in the light of new perspectives, etc. Statues are really different. Statues are actually meant to celebrate and laud an individual. Yeah. Nobody builds. I mean, one of my jokes is that's one of the reasons you don't find statues to Satan in churches, because they are meant to laud you. You're meant to think very well of them. Yeah. So they're not just kind of like, oh, this is our past. You're erasing our past. Actually, my view is that in toppling Colston's statue, in Bristol that day, actually across the globe, millions and millions, and yet even more millions, hundreds of millions of people for the first time discovered more about the slave trade through the toppling of individuals' statues into watery grave than I think 1,000 books or 1,000 documentaries would have made possible. So rather than erasing history, what that did was it actually created history. So I think that there is that subtle thing. Just very briefly, just in the last thing, I think monuments, my view is you can never, you should, you can't, you shouldn't. It's not ethically possible. Just because a slave trader built a museum or a building, you shouldn't demolish that. What you can do is you can interpret that building. You can do stuff in that building, which is much more reflective of our art, our culture, our values today.
Fantastic. So, you know, it's really important for us to be able to contextualize the history of the British Empire with the stories and the people of the people and the lands they extracted from. Now, this is full disclosure. I've known Raj for 20 years, and he's taken in many waifs and strays like me over the years. And we've shared a history and a culture. You as an Indian Punjabi and me as a Pakistani Kashmiri. That was very simply ruptured by the partition of India 73 years ago.
You're silent. Farah, can't hear you.
I don't know why this is.
That's fine. That's okay.
Great. So, how do you connect these histories of partition, of this rupture from land, of this disconnection from land, with your own sort of stories and the way that you see nature and land now?
Okay. So, I think land, nature, the notion of the green and pleasant land that we live in, yeah. There is the way it's often portrayed romantically is that it's since time immemorial. Actually, it's not since time immemorial. If you go into the countryside that we have today, the way you look at it, the way you see it, the way you perceive it, it's actually no more than 300 years old. It was changed fundamentally by the Enclosures Acts, which brought together, reconstituted small holdings on which the vast majority of people in this country, in England, Britain, worked the land, small patches, into large units, which were then gradually came to be owned by rich people. Yeah. Until then, the patchwork, the countryside used to be very, very different. So it's a human-made endeavor. I mean, one of my favorite paintings is which I've used as a prop for history lectures years and years ago for a number of times, is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews by Gainsborough, I think. And it shows Mr. Andrews, who's holding a gun with a dog at his feet, his wife, very, very beautiful wife, all dressed in sort of like light yellow silk. And you find his home in the background, his massive palatial mansion of a house in the background. And you see haystacks lying there, you know. And I often think of that painting. So the official name is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And I often, for the purposes of my lectures, I would often name it me Mrs., me house, me dog, and me gun, yeah, and me land, obviously, yeah. So I think we need to understand that the land, the way we view it today, has been shaped by very powerful economic and political forces, and that actually had an impact in colonial times as well. The colonies were largely used for one purpose and one purpose only. That was to extract materials, raw materials, which were then shipped here to Britain, where they'd be reprocessed, manufactured. If you take tobacco, if you take tea, if you take steel, if you take shipbuilding, you take just any number of different things, Britain would be the manufacturing center. And these things were then sent back to the colonies. So no colony during colonialism developed any great industry. They were basically extractive things where you extracted raw materials from, you reprocess them here, just to recap once again. And then you used those countries to dump those goods, those fully made goods, manufactured goods. And in the process, what happened often was that the incipient, the small, few industrial capacity that those places had was totally destroyed. And there's a, it's a very kind of, it's a very sort of, in a sense, very parasitic kind of relationship that Britain had with colonialism. And I'll give you an example of this. One of my colleagues who works at Birmingham University did a lecture for me at Kettleston Hall. It's the former residence of Lord Curzon, who was the Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1904. And in the lecture, she talked about that there's in Kettleston Hall, if you go in there, in the Eastern Museum, there's a big tiger rug, basically, a massive tiger rug. And she said that it made her feel very emotional. But she said there's this thing, she repeated this kind of quote, that when the British came to India, they found a land teeming with game and wildlife. By the time they'd left it, hardly anything was left. So she said, she feels really emotional that the land that she was born in, which had given, she's a Bangladesh origin, and she said that the land that her ancestors really were born in, which gave name to the fabulous Bengal tiger, is the land that she says she feels that in her own lifetime, the tiger will probably no longer be there, probably be extinct. So the impact of colonialism on the environment of those places, it's still there, still felt to this day.
And that's really important, is that connection that we, as diaspora, and you as a first generation immigrant, like feel to our homes as well, is really tied up in those objects of nature that have been left behind, as it were. And I remember you telling me a wonderful story about Pomegranate Tree from your village.
Yes, yeah. Whenever I had a very Arcadian childhood. Well, the Arcadian bit was during the holidays when we used to go to my mum's village, and I had this fascination with the pomegranate tree, and it's quite an emotional thing. I as a child, I just really was. Every time we went to my mum's village, I'd rush to this little garden, this walled garden, and look at the pomegranate sort of tree and see if there was any bloom, as it were. And I asked my mum one day about the pomegranate tree when I grew up a few years ago, just a few years ago. I found out the truth about it, that at partition, my mum and her family, like so many others from both sides, from India to Pakistan, from Pakistan to India, there are no total victims and no total saviors in this. Yeah, there were good people on either side of the border. There were evil bastards on either side of the border, and so on and so forth. But my mom, and I know as a historian that for most people the experience was that they could only carry the clothes on their backs and nothing else. And of course, hundreds of thousands died in that. My mom said that one of my uncles, who after partition had made quite, he's quite wealthy. He was a businessman and a landowner. He could never forget where he was born, where he'd come from. So 10 years after partition, one of his friends from that village invited him to visit. So my uncle, cutting a long story short, got to visit. Unfortunately, the village is very near the international border. And as they approached the village, so everybody came to greet him. So as they approached the village, there was a picket of security men, and they wouldn't allow him into the village. Despite any entreaty, they wouldn't allow him into the village. And he, in despair, when he realized that he'd come so far, so near and yet so far, he threw himself on the ground and he cried and he screamed. A great cry arose from his breast, from his heart, and he said, "If I can't go back to my ancestral village, the place that I was born in, at least let me have a memento of it that I can take back." So his friend walked back to the village, went to the family orchard, and from the orchard he plucked 2 saplings of pomegranate and rolled them up in cotton cloth with some soil and kept it wet and gave it to my uncle. My uncle cried, hugged it like a baby, like a child, and carried it back to India, to his new village, almost like he would carry a newborn child with tenderness. And then he planted one where I saw it as a child in his own yard, and the other one he planted by his brick kiln business. He laid a new orchard because he loved orchards. He laid a new orchard on his land, and the pride in that orchard was the pomegranate tree. So years later, I wrote a short story, and that short story has just been published by the National Archives. It's on their websites, and somebody, a wonderful artist, I think Tips his name is. I think he's done the artwork for it. So to me, the pomegranate is an object that is of the memory of partition, and it's deepened my desire, in a sense, to learn about, to go to, and to write about the land of my ancestors, which was a multicultural civilization where people from different religions, different backgrounds lived together for the most part and rubbed along very nicely.
Great. Just a reminder to keep your questions coming in to the chat box, and we'll close to Raj. So we have one here from Jim, who says it's very interesting. Let me get that up properly. He says it's very interesting talking about the Pomegranate Tree. Our art centre in a Victorian school building built in 1894 is located in an area with nearly 100 different languages spoken. A century ago, in the aftermath of the mass slaughter of World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic, the pupils planted memorial trees to commemorate those who fell in the war and to beautify and enhance the area. Perhaps history has a lesson we can learn from and reinterpret involving the people who live here now. So tree cover then was down to 4 or 5%, the lowest in recorded history. It's about 13% now, but needs to be trebled that. Is there a way of keying to the historical spin and maybe try to connect with the diaspora on our doorstep?
Just the previous sentence I missed, Farah. Just the previous sentence.
The last sentence, is there a way of keying into the need for reforestation with a historical spin and trying to connect with the diaspora on our doorsteps?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there are many ways of connecting with the diaspora. I'll give you an example. So as you might have seen for so many times, when you come to our house, your house really, and you see in the fruit bowl, there's always a pomegranate. There's always a pomegranate in fruit bowl. I don't always use it, but there's always a pomegranate because of that sort of attachment. And people talk about preparations and so on and so forth. I mean, I was reading this morning about wildlife in Kenya, for instance. Yeah, because from the time of colonization, the land was no longer, for the large part, used simply to sustain people, to sustain them as human beings in what often used to be a barter economy. The land became a commodity for generating profits. So we were talking about statues. Well, Leopold, the king of the Belgians. I mean, Jesus, for goodness sake, I mean, Hitler pales into kind of something different in comparison to Leopold. I mean, Leopold had more than 10 million people's deaths on his hands because Leopold personally owned Congo as his own private property, as his own private plantation, and very strict targets were set for people who lived and worked there to produce rubber, for instance, or other materials, cocoa, for instance, yeah. And if people didn't, their limbs were cut off, etc. So it was just a massive kind of concentration. The whole country was sort of like a massive concentration camp, which killed millions and millions of people. And I think one of the ways that Britain we can repair that, or we can try and, at least in a small way, undo that justice, is to contribute towards one, in the origins of diaspora countries of diaspora origin, in the home countries, as it were, is to support those initiatives through various resources and sources which redevelop the land as a natural habitat, land as a natural mother earth in a sense that gives if we look after it. Yeah. Here, I think, what we experience is that what we eat, what we consume, has to a large extent been changed by the fact that most the diaspora communities brought such fantastic traditions of food, of vegetables, etc., which I think enrich our lives. So there isn't any easy answer, but I think people's relationship to land is much more dear in other countries than perhaps we have. We don't have. I mean, when you go to if you go to India, for instance, you don't get a cellophane piece of vegetable or a fruit. You just there are bowls of fruit, big baskets of fruit and vegetables. You just buy those.
And how you have a 9-year-old son, and he's the age of the children that you work with in colonial countryside. How do you have these huge conversations with these very, very young children about the past and also about the future?
Oh, fantastic question. Look, Kabir is of a generation. It's like kind of like the Hobbesian idea of human beings. We're all born sinful, that we're all born bastards essentially, and that's what we say for the rest of our lives. Yeah. And then there's a Rousseauian idea, which is that we're born as a blank slate and we can be shaped by whatever influences come to us. I think Kabir is much more of a Rousseauian kind of, if you look at him, he's more of a sort of Rousseauian product, as it were. Look, the environment that they grow up in, for instance, I don't have to do that much work. Yeah? I mean, his school is a multicultural school. So for them, the way they're growing up, the way they've been educated, for instance, even in comparison to your generation, for instance, diverse sexuality to his generation is not an issue at all. Yeah, they don't raise an eyebrow about that, about the fact that I remember a conversation we had about 2 years ago in this house with one of his friends, Sam, who and it was about the fact that one of their friends has two mothers instead of mother and father. And the other boy, his friend, raised, oh, really? Two mothers. And Kabir sort of said, yeah, it's perfectly natural, to have two mothers or two fathers, or a mother and a father. I think issue, again, the same thing with racism, is that for them, the notion of seeing somebody as their peers as being somehow inferior or superior or good or bad, simply because the color of their skin is different, is totally unknown. And I just want to show you an example. I mean, of his thinking. He did. Ever the little soul who doesn't want to do any work, look for any excuses. Last week he said, "Oh, I feel very artistic at the moment. Can I do a portrait of you?" I don't know if you can see it. So he drew a portrait of me, sort of like a pen portrait of me, and in the fascinating thing in the pen portrait you probably won't be able to see is it says, what does it say? Warning: doesn't play well with racists. No, I hadn't told him to do that. I just sat for him for about 15 minutes, yeah, and was very stiff by the end of it. But that's just come from him. At the age of 9, he knows that racism is not a good thing. So warning: doesn't play well with racists. And I think that really, encapsulates our generation. But then, at the end of the day, it's peer pressure. It's also our responsibility as parents to inculcate at least certain progressive values into our children, because often when they're out in the world and they hear kind of like contradictory or reactionary views, if they've had that foundation, they'd be good, caring, compassionate human beings.
Great, and we've got just 2 minutes, so we've got one more question. So Ruby, are you going to?
Yeah, sure. So one that's come through from the audience. So you've said that the children that you work with, Raj, as part of the Colonial Countryside, have quite low engagement with culture and especially the National Trust. So what about their relationship to green spaces? So could you tell us a bit about, in the context of the Black Lives Matter, so there's been a lot of talk about how many people of colour do not feel safe or welcome outdoors and in green spaces. So how might we challenge and change that? Sorry, that's a big question to close with. It'd be great
But
to
that's a really excellent question as well. I think the low levels of engagement with culture are actually in some areas, in the nearly all urban areas, and they are. I think the Arts Council has a program called something people and places, creative people, creative places, yeah. And in Birmingham, we have certain, not just in Birmingham, sorry, I really mean in this area in the Midlands, for instance, in the Black Country. The Black Country is an area of, low levels of engagement. If you live in a countryside, this is a really complex thing. It's very difficult for me to explain to you. If you are non-white, this is so subtle. I feel really dreadful even explaining this. If you're non-white, there are subtle messages often in society which tell you that isn't yours. The countryside isn't yours. I'm going to give you an example in a minute of this. Yeah, that arts and cultural institutions, you don't belong here. Yeah. I think there is something often in the countryside, the way that the countryside nature is projected, which one, I mean, often if you don't have the resources, it's difficult to access to start with. But number two is that you often are made to feel unwelcome. Psychologically, it works. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I used to work in Sandwell Borough Council as the Heritage and Arts Officer, and I used to manage the museums and arts. And I invited the leader of the council, Lord King, a Lord King, not just Mr. King, but Lord King, a former leader of the council. I invited him to inaugurate an exhibition at one of the few decent historical buildings we had at Tudor Manor House called Oak House, which is where my office was as well. So he came and he spoke and he was very happy. And then he took me aside. As it happens, he and I originate from the same city in Punjab. And he took me aside privately. Raji says, I've been leader of the council for a number of years. I've never come to this place. I said, why not? He said, because even though I'm the leader of the council and I have so many billions of money at my disposal, which I have to then kind of like spend on this area for this council area, he said, I always felt this house wasn't for me. It was for other people. I couldn't go in. And you just imagine, you magnify that so many times. If the leader of a council who has a multi-billion-pound budget at his disposal, if he feels that he's unwelcome at a Tudor Manor House, just imagine how others would feel. So I think there are many, many barriers to that. And the beautiful thing about colonial countryside is that by taking children, by engaging with children, not just taking them, by actually engaging with children and researching and interacting with these historic properties, what you're doing is for the first time you are shaking away. It's like Mrs. Havisham's house in Dickens in Great Expectations. That for the first time you're opening the curtains. Yeah, you're taking off the all this kind of the sheets on the furniture. You're letting in a breath of fresh air. And I find that, I find that absolutely fantastic. Children getting into, at one of the properties, Charlesford House, children getting into a row with staff saying, the sword wasn't taken, it was looted. And a massive row developed. And guess what? The children won it. So they wrote a leaflet about the fact that the sword was stolen from the siege of Lucknow, the siege of Residency in Lucknow in 1857. It wasn't just taken, it was stolen. So I love that notion that you have children from inner city areas who now have access to the countryside, to houses of the National Trust, and they contribute so much energy, so much new knowledge. And I think we as human beings, anybody, whether you're black or white or Asian or what have you, when you go into those houses, as a result of that change, we're all enriched by the general pool of knowledge.
Fantastic. On that note, we have to finish up. Thank you for everyone for your comments and questions. So we'll get to any questions that we didn't get to today. We'll pose to Raj and get some answers for you in a follow-up email. Thank you so much, Raj, for joining us today.
It's been a real pleasure. I just wish I'd spoken less. I really do. I also have so much to say. I've got notes here, so I'd be really happy. I'd be really happy to entertain questions, and I'd be happy to write answers or interact in any way you think is valuable, because I think this is a fantastic area for discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raj. And I'll hand back over to Ruby to close up.
Thank you so much for your personal stories and inspiration, Raj. That's been absolutely fantastic. I'm just going to very quickly share the results of the poll that we did earlier. So some quite interesting results here. You can see that 3/4 of us have been able to spend more time outside in nature because of COVID. And then kind of equally around 1/8 of responders have either kind of struggled to feel connected to nature because of a lack of access to green space, or felt no more or less connected to nature than usual. And I just wanted to as well thank so much to Farah for hosting this conversation. Thanks so much to Raj for some excellent inspiration. And I just wanted to quickly summarize next steps. So we do encourage you to keep the conversation going. So you've got hashtag Creative Climate Chat and our social handles as well. So at Julie's Bicycle, at Colonial Country with a 1. We will share those again shortly. And do sign up to our bulletin as well, so we can tell you about news and events that we've got going. So these talks are these are going to be every week until next week. So next week, we're really excited to have Zamzam Ibrahim, who's the president of the Students Organising for Sustainability and former president of the NUS. And she's going to be talking about her work mobilising students in the UK on climate and climate justice. So that's Wednesday, the 1st of July at the same time at 4:30. There are still a few spaces, so please do join up and join us on the live stream as well. We'll then be having a little bit of a pause, and the following sessions after next week will be happening every fortnight. But again, we'll be able to tell you all of that if you stay in conversation with us either by social or by the bulletin. As we mentioned before, we're also going to be collating some of the fantastic resources that were shared from all of you. So thank you so much for kind of participating. And as well, there are a couple of questions. We're really sorry, we've run out of time to answer, but Raj has very kindly offered to take those. So we will certainly be sending those to him and getting back to all of you, as well as sending around the video link as well, so that you can share. The final two things to quickly mention: there'll be a very short survey. We'd really appreciate it. It really helps us to improve these sessions. We do take note of what you leave in them. If you could just take a minute to complete that, we'll send that round tomorrow as well. We'd really appreciate it. And finally, we would just like to draw your attention to a letter. I'm hoping my colleague can add that to the chat box for you now. We've just sent that to the Cultural Secretary. It's being endorsed by, I think we're now at more than 650 organisations and individuals from right across the cultural sector who are endorsing our call for a just and green cultural recovery. It talks to so much of the conversation we've just been having about the need for social and climate justice in this space and to act urgently. So please do endorse that and share the words as well. We'd love your support with it. Any more words from yourself, Farah or Raj?
I'm just really glad. Thank you so much. It's been a real joy and a privilege.
Thank you so much for joining us, Raj. And we will close up now. Thanks so much to everyone for joining, and we'll be sending the recording on shortly. Thank you.